everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Also consider joining my Patreon page for some cool perks. I'll leave a link in the description. Let's launch into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 9 of White Line Fever by Lemmy. Chapter 9 is called No Remorse. Let's find out what happens next. Finding a new guitar player wasn't a difficult process, really. I just did an interview in Melody Maker in which I mentioned that we were going to get somebody unknown this time around, and the applications flocked in. It was so simple, in fact, that we wound up choosing 2 guitarists. After trying out about 7 or 8 guys, Phil and I narrowed it down to 2 contenders. Some of the others were good, but they just weren't right for Motorhead. In the end, Phil Campbell and Mike Wurzel-Burston were the only ones I would have gone near. I had never heard of Phil Campbell's prior band, Persian Risk, but apparently they had recorded a couple singles. He was in London playing with his band when we were trying out people, and on their way out of town in the van he said, "Let me off here, lads. I've just got to go and see somebody about a dog," or some such lie. You can't really tell them you're going for an audition, can you? After all, you might not get it. Phil was quite nervous, but he was so sure of his ability that he practically walked in as if he were just showing up for a rehearsal. He laid a couple lines out and went zapping back out, rushing around, speeding out of his head. If this gives you the impression that he was something of a maniac, you're right. I only found out just how much of one later on. He definitely added to the Motorhead legend over the years. Wurzel, on the other hand, was nearly a basket case when he came in, but I was already favorably inclined toward him from the letter he sent me. He enclosed a silly-looking photo of himself and a note that read, "I hear you're looking for an unknown guitarist. Well, there's nobody more unknown than me." That warmed my heart immediately. When he came in to audition, however, he was shaking from fear. On top of that, he had walked all the way from the station carrying his guitar and his bag of pedals. No doubt his arms were killing him. "I've got a list of songs," he said, and the paper was rattling in his hand. "Give me that for sake," I said, snatching it away from him. "Don't worry. Sit down. Have a couple vodkas, man. You'll be all right." So he had a couple drinks, after which he played for us, and he was all right. Usually at auditions they fly you in for 10 minutes and send you flying back out again, but I don't see any sense in that. If you want a good guitar player, let him play his best. Wurzel later said in the press that that was the fairest audition he ever did, and it worked obviously because he wound up getting the gig. We liked both Phil and Wurzel immensely. Incidentally, both of them lied about their ages. Wurzel said he was younger, and Phil said he was older. I'm the only one who never seems to lie about his age. We couldn't decide between the two of them. So we had them both come back. The plan was to hold a battle of the guitarists to see which of them came out on top. Then the morning of the final audition, Filthy left the band. Our manager Douglas called me up early at 9 in the morning and said, "I'm coming to pick you up in 5 minutes. "What for?" I asked. "We got to see Phil Taylor," he told me, and I knew right then what was up. I hadn't been seeing much of Phil, but I had been getting the impression that he wasn't really keen anymore. Although we didn't discuss his reason for leaving the band, I think part of it was because he wanted to become a serious musician, or whatever it is that people think heavy metal isn't, which, if you ask me, is total bull. To this day, metal is one of the best-selling types of rock. In fact, it is true rock and roll. And it takes as much talent and determination to get anywhere as just about any other form of music. And it's fun, so what more could you ask for? Anyhow, I believe that was one of his reasons. And our troubles with Brian Robertson aside, Filthy was one of the biggest Thin Lizzy fans in existence. Although he fired Brian from Motorhead along with me, he still believed that Brian was a loftier pinnacle to reach for than Motorhead was. He must have thought that because he wound up doing a band with Brian for a while, or who knows, maybe he just wanted to get away from me. Anyway, Douglas and I went round to his house, and he told us, "I'm leaving." "Man, your timing is great," I said. There we were with auditions to do that day with 2 guitarists who had traveled from Cheltenham and Wales. Now, I didn't have a drummer. But I have to admit, Phil was a gentleman about the whole thing. The band was committed to appear on a Young Ones show not long after he left, and he came back and did that with us. He did leave decently, unlike some of Motorhead's former members. That was small comfort, however, when I had to face Wurzel and Phil Campbell that afternoon. For a time frame of a few hours, I was the only member of Motorhead. I really didn't know what to do, so when I got to the rehearsal room, I said to them, "Look, Phil's a bit late. You guys talk amongst yourselves a minute. Have a drink. I've just got to go across the road." Then I went out and played One Armed Bandit in the Boozer for a quarter of an hour. When I came back, I caught a bit of their discussion. "If I played this, then you could play that part," I could hear. They were already talking over how to persuade me to take them both, but they didn't have to try because I'd been thinking along the same lines. A four-piece is a lot more capable of playing different stuff. With two guitar players, you're bound to get that. Obviously, I had to take a reduction in money, but it proved worth it for the next decade. Once that was decided, I broke the news about Filthy's leaving. Things were a bit downcast, but only momentarily. Phil Campbell suggested Pete Gill as a replacement, and that seemed like a good choice to me. I remembered him as being a real attacker from the tour he did with us in 1979 when he was with Saxon. Later I heard that Brian Downey, Thin Lizzy's old drummer, was interested in the gig. I wish I had known about that, and wouldn't it have burned Filthy. But Pete did all right for us for a few years. We asked him down to a rehearsal, and he was all for it. He came and we played about 2 songs, and then we all stood there with stupid smiles on our faces because it sounded so great. Pete was something of an odd character. He was drinking when he first joined us, and he's one of the funniest in the world when he's been drinking. But then he stopped drinking and became this born-again jogger, and he was kind of difficult after that. He wasn't really jogging anyway. He only used to go down to the Calf and have breakfast and then jog back as if he had been jogging the whole time. I know this because we followed him one day. He started to do some really strange things, Pete. He used to take his clothes off at odd moments. The first gig we ever played with him, there was a power cut in the middle of the show, and he jumped up and dropped his trousers, which I thought was a very unusual reaction. Sometimes he'd just pull his out. Like we'd be in an airplane, and as the stewardess walked by, he'd take it out and wave it behind her back. Then if she turned around, he'd put his paper over it. It really got to be a drag. Motorhead is nothing if not democratic, but I don't think it's fair to be waving your around when people are minding their own business and might not want to see it. Then there were the items he had sitting in the back window of his car, a riding crop, a hard hat, and this colorful umbrella. I don't pretend to know what was going on in Pete's head, but later on, I heard he came out of the closet and admitted he was gay. That made some small sense out of a few of his actions. One thing that never made any sense was the black notebook he kept with him at all times. Phil Campbell found it after Pete had been with us for 2 years. He peeked in it, and it was some sort of diary or ledger or something. 10 days after he had joined the band, Pete had written down, "Phil Campbell owes me 50 pence. Talk about wasting your time. But of course, all this was in the future. At the time, having a completely new bunch of geezers to play with was brilliant. It took 10 years off me easily because they were so excited. First off, we did 6 dates in Finland to warm up, and we had an hysterical good time. All the way through Finland, we were dissolved in fits of laughter. We were playing really well, and we were out of it with joy. In fact, it was probably the best time we ever had with Wurzel. One night he was so drunk he was lying in bed, and the roadies were pouring beer all over him. And I nicked his bird, which was only fair play because he already had mine. Man, those Finnish gigs were like Fellini's Satire-Con backstage. It was so horrifying, it was great. I got some wonderful chicks on that tour. One place I remember we had to drive through 4 miles of quarry to get to this hut where the gig was, and it was packed. I don't know where these people came from. At another show, the Finnish lighting guy wound up in a wardrobe with this chick. He couldn't go anyplace else because we were in the crew room and we wouldn't let him in the band room, of course. So he took this bird into the wardrobe so she could suck him off, but he turned it round so the doors were facing the wall. They were in pitch darkness and the chick started gurgling and threw up on his jeans. There he was, stuck with this sick bird moaning around the floor, surrounded by this terrible stench. Finally, he broke through the back of the wardrobe. Those shows were great fun. Back in London, we did a gig at Hammersmith Odeon straight away. It was May 7th, 1984. At that show, Pete Gill and Rat Scabies ran upstairs and smashed a sink off the wall of the men's room. We got fined for that by Hammersmith Odeon, but no matter. We wowed the audience that night. It was a complete triumph. We just had a new bomber rig made. Half of the old one had been stolen by gypsies. They'd broken into the compound and absconded with various bits of it for scrap metal. That second bomber rig was nearly lethal. After one show we did with it, we found a split in the metal in the back of the wing, so the rig was liable to collapse at any second. And had it fallen, believe me, we would have been thoroughly crushed. As it was, I got hit on the head by the thing regularly. Still, it was a great prop. Obviously, Motorhead was ready to take the world by storm once again. Our fans were ready for it, and we certainly were ready for it. Our record company, however, had lost it as far as we were concerned. We had a lot about Bronze during the time we were working with them, but looking back on it now, especially considering the subsequent labels we went through, the people there were really great. But by 1984, Jerry Braun had stopped being interested in us personally, and that rankled us a bit because Motorhead was his star turn. Braun signed a lot of people off on a reputation. Girl School, Tank, they even got Hawkwind. Our trouble with Braun's really began after Eddie Clark left the band. They didn't like Brian Robertson, and they didn't seem to have much faith in the new lineup either. For our next album, they wanted to do a compilation of our old songs. That was an indication. When people start putting together compilations of a band's prior, you know they're readying the death nail. Braun seemed to think we were finished, and anything more that we did would fail miserably. Boy, did we have news for them. No doubt they would have preferred for us to break up. There was no way that was going to happen, though, and I insisted that if they wanted a compilation, they were damn well going to add some new songs by Motorhead's new lineup. I also took charge of selecting the old tracks that appeared on the record, and wrote a commentary about each song, so that wound up being No Remorse. During the latter part of May, we recorded 6 songs. 4 of them, Killed by Death, Steal Your Face, Snaggletooth, and Locomotive, ended up on No Remorse. The other 2 tracks we did went on the flip side of the Killed by Death single, and were both called Under the Knife. They were 2 completely different songs, however. Maybe that sounds confusing, and it was meant to be. That's what's missing from record companies, that kind of lunacy for its own sake. That's the great British legacy to the world. Humor from, like, The Goon Show, The Young Ones, and Monty Python. Some people don't get it, which is too bad for them. You're supposed to laugh in life. Laughing exercises all the facial muscles and keeps you from getting old. Looking stern gives you terrible wrinkles. But like I was saying earlier, our problems with Bronze were no laughing matter. They did promote No Remorse in the single very well, I will give them that. But it had the aura of a last hurrah. They advertised the record on television. It wasn't all that great, really. Just a live shot of us making a racket and touting us as the loudest band in the world and all that usual smear. Nothing to write home about there. We did a photo shoot for the single that was funny as though. Each of us in the band were supposed to illustrate the different ways to be killed by death. They put me in an electric chair, Wurzel was shown being crucified, Phil was being burned at the stake, and Pete faced a firing squad. For that last shot, we were dressed up as a Mexican revolutionaries with rifles and all, and we took a break to buy Cornish pasties at the supermarket next door. It made the shoppers rather nervous. They backed themselves up against the wall, in fact. But we told them, it's all right, Roberts don't look like this. Too obvious. We also went to Arizona to film a video for Killed by Death. I don't remember who paid for that. I don't think Bronze did. No doubt we probably did. MTV banned it for a really stupid reason. I was riding a motorcycle, and it was this girl, and I put my hand on her leg and slid it up behind me. They didn't like that. It was bull. That was when they were playing the out of Michael Jackson's Thriller video, which had people coming out of the ground with pouring out of their noses, but they didn't seem to have a problem with that. Anyhow, photo shoots and TV commercials aside, things just weren't the same with Bronze, and we decided we wanted off the label. What ensued was nearly 2 years of legal, which kept us from recording an album that whole time. We also had other annoyances to deal with, too. Phil Campbell was still tied up with Persian Risk old label, and Pete Gill was in litigation over some money Saxon apparently owed him. So while the whole band wrote the music for the new songs we recorded, only Wurzel and I were able to take credit. Things were just 10 times more complicated than they should have been all around. Since we couldn't put any records out for the time being, we just did what came naturally. We spent all of our time on the road. Our first gig after the No Remorse sessions was for the annual TT motorcycle race on the Isle of Man. We drank lots of free Pernod that day, and later I woke up in bed thinking it was really warm in that hotel room. Then I noticed my feet were on fire. I'd fallen asleep holding a lit cigarette and the bed was in flames. I had to scoop up all the sheets and chuck them in the bath. Like that used to happen to us all the time. Once at a place where I used to live, I woke up and the whole mattress except where I was lying was red. The cigarette had burned through the mattress and it was about to blow up. I hurled myself off the bed fast, and just as I did, it exploded. Fire up to the ceiling. That scared the out of me. After the Isle of Man, we headlined the Heavy Sound Festival in Belgium. That was a classic lineup for the era. On the bill with us were Twisted Sister, Metallica, by then I'd gotten to know them fairly well, and to this day they're amongst our biggest fans, Merciful Fate and Lita Ford, who I knew from her time in the Runaways, plus a few smaller, long-lost bands. A little over a month later, we toured Australia and New Zealand for the first time. Traveling from England to New Zealand is a real pain in the ass, by the way. It took us a nightmare flight of 32 hours to get there, 3-hour layover in Sydney and propeller plane to the island included. Then we got to the hotel and discovered that, yes, the tap water does go round the sink in a different direction. I turned on the TV to find a 2-year-old episode of Coronation Street. It was a bit of a culture shock. Things are very weird down there. We died a death in Dunedin, our first gig. Then a few days later in Palmerston North, they had a riot. The audience was freaking out and running around. Some guy got stabbed in the butt, and the theater was destroyed. It got better though. Wellington and Auckland were good. Then we went to Australia, and that was very good indeed. Australia is great because it's like the old American frontier. When you get away from the big cities and drive to the small towns, it's all verandas and old sidewalks. You go into the bar and the fans going around and there are flies everywhere and the town drunk is slumped over the counter, just like you see in old saloons in the movies. They really loved us in Australia, and especially Melbourne, where our main fan base is. They gave us new guitars at one gig. Wurzel got a blue one, and before we went on stage we could hear the audience singing, "Who's the man with the blue guitar? Wurzel! Wurzel!" One guy followed us all over the continent. He pawned his VCR to do it. He beat us to town on the trek from Adelaide to Melbourne. His car was dead because that's not a hospitable climate, but apparently it was worth it to him, and he wrote about the experience later. We stopped home in September just long enough to work up a couple of new tunes. The later wound up on Orgasmatron, and then we did a few dates in Hungary. It was a very weird experience. No customs at all to deal with. We went straight through into the VIP lounge with all these Russians looking bemusedly at us. Obviously, if you're going to be a promoter in Hungary, you're going to know the border guards, right? No doubt about that. There was a car on the tarmac, and we were whisked straight through with top-notch treatment. Went right through to the venue in Budapest, sound check, and were taken back to the hotel. The next day, we went to the gig to find a whole army lined up around the site, and these Hungarians just ran right through them. They were excited because I think we were the first band to play there for a long time. What a sight! Thousands of people storming the Hungarian army. We performed in front of an audience of 27,000. Great show. The killer was it was in Hungary, so nobody heard about it. I always find that when you play in these depressed so-called third world countries, the people are much more trusting and kind. They're more enthusiastic about everything. Considering that, what has civilization done for us? Blunted our sensibilities and made us less open and tolerant? Civilization is apparently a curse. God bless the open market. Back in England, before starting off on our tour to promote No Remorse, it had come out in the UK a month before, we made an appearance on ITV's Saturday Starship, a kid's Saturday morning show, the successor to 'Tis Was. Apparently some people complained because we were rehearsing early in the morning for the show in the station's parking lot. I don't know what the problem was. 8:30 a.m. was the time they gave us to rehearse, and they put the stage up in the parking lot for us. Then we did the Woo-Arg Weekenders Festival in Norfolk, which was put on by the magazine Kerrang! That was a terrible show, and as is typical in the world of Motorhead, it was broadcast. Halfway through our British tour, Wurzel had to go to the hospital because he had kidney stones, so we finished up the dates as a three-piece. Our last gig at Hammersmith Odon, he was allowed to play on a few songs. They put him in a wheelchair and two nurses rolled him out onto the stage. The whole place was cheering for him. Keep in mind that at this point he had been in the band for less than a year. Plus, we got a silver disc that night for No Remorse. For a band that was supposed to be finished, I'd say that was a rather impressive showing. We spent the last part of '84 touring America. It was the first time for Phil and Wurzel. Pete had already been there with Saxon, and I played tour guide for them. I really enjoyed myself on that trip because the last couple years with Phil, Taylor, and Eddie hadn't been that much fun. And with Brian, it was no fun at all. That was a year and a half of torture, in fact. But like I said, when young guys join the band, it really takes years off of you. We finished out the year by filming a video clip for MTV. They opened the door to find us all singing a hideously off-key rendition of Silent Night. Then we ended December by doing a few dates in Germany. Those were actually our last shows for a few months. We spent the first part of '85 doing TV appearances, most of them for Britain, a couple for Sweden. We were on the debut show of ITV's Extra Celestial Transmission, or ECT, or Eric Clapton's Tit, as I fondly called it. It was this heavy metal show, and they asked the audience to dress outrageously. In the spirit of the occasion, I had the makeup department do an incredibly realistic double scar down my face, and I dressed all gangsterish in a white double-breasted jacket, a favorite of mine, black shirt, white tie, and wraparound shades. A couple of Hell's Angels friends of mine saw our appearance and offered to off the guy who gave me the scar. I also made a few appearances on my own here and there. I flew over to Germany to perform on a TV show with Kirsty MacColl. Rest in peace, she was a really great bird. I was on guitar dressed in shades and a teddy boy outfit, and I sank to my knees doing a solo. Actually, I had no idea what I was playing. Frankie Goes to Hollywood was on the same show, and I came up on stage with them too. They were all very pleased for some reason, and later, when they had a gig at Hammersmith Odon, they asked me up for Relax. I was supposed to play guitar during it, but I didn't know the chords. Nobody knew who I was anyway. Frankie's crowd wasn't exactly Motorheads, and they were well bemused. We had a party at the Holiday Inn in Chelsea that night, which we went to. Gary Glitter was there with a drink and a cigarette in each hand. He didn't know whether he was on his ass or his elbow. And there were two girls in Basque hanging around who desperately wanted to Frankie's bass player. Only Holly Johnson and the other singer were gay. That's all they wanted, and he was the only guy they didn't. They had everybody else, including Motorhead. You'd get a blowjob, and as you were leaving, they'd say, "If you see the bass player." But then he'd left with his wife over 2 hours before. The last time I saw Holly Johnson was at a Frankie show at Wembley, and he had this huge geezer as his boyfriend, who was very obstructionist. One of those types that protects people from everyone, even their friends. Holly was leaving the band, and I told him not to. I said, "You're making a terrible mistake." And it was a mistake because no one's heard of him since, or any of the others, and they were huge for a while. I also met Samantha Fox that year. We were both judging the spaghetti eating contest. There were some animals at that thing. I had been a fan of hers since she was a Page 3 girl, and we were thinking of doing Love Hurts as a single together. I did a tape and gave it to her to listen to, but our schedules got in the way, and unfortunately, it never happened. She's another one that practically disappeared. She's very cute, but I think she was kind of misdirected. Her father was her manager, which is always a mistake, and he managed her right into oblivion. But she seems to have reappeared once again. Motorhead recently did our first ever shows in Russia, and we went to a club owned by the promoter, and there was Sam Fox. We had a great reunion there. Even though Motorhead couldn't make any records for the time being, it didn't stop us from doing other things such as benefit records. Jerry Marston of Gary and the Pacemakers got a bunch of geezers together to sing You'll Never Walk Alone, with the proceeds going to the Bradford City Football Stadium Fire Disaster Fund. Wurzel and I were on it along with Phil Winnott and Gary Holden, among others. That song went to #1 and earned a gold disc. I also produced a Ramones song along with Guy Benmead, Go Home Ann, from their Bonzo Goes to Bitburg EP. I wish it had been one of their faster numbers like Beat on the Brat or I Want to Be Sedated. At the end of June, Motorhead was coming up on our 10-year anniversary, and we did a couple of shows at Hammersmith to celebrate. Those were fun gigs. That first night, everybody who had ever been in Motorhead showed up on stage, which was amazing. Wendy O. Williams and Girls School were there too. The second night, everybody showed up again, except for Larry Wallace. Even Lucas Fox was there, and he had only been in the band a few months. Since we couldn't get 3 drum kits on stage, we hung a guitar around Lucas, but he wasn't supposed to be plugged in. Of course, he was plugged in, while Brian Robertson wasn't. Typical. And Phil Lynott came on stage because he just couldn't resist it. We were doing Motorhead, but he had no idea what he was playing. Eddie Clark was over there going, "E!" but he didn't remember it either. Phil was a good friend of mine, but he had never heard our signature tune. We were recording those shows, and Vic Mail did a special mix of it with Phil's bass up front and gave it to him just to embarrass him. He had his revenge posthumously. When I went up on stage with Duff McKagan's band a couple years back at the Hollywood Palladium, they started playing The Boys Are Back in Town, and I didn't know it. I was supposed to do a different song with them, but they switched on me. Anyhow, the second gig ended up with a huge birthday cake being rolled out, and this little bird jumped out of it with these big balloons under her t-shirt. I took her home that night. Actually, I was going out with her at the time. Katie, her name was. What a little beauty. We released a video of that gig called The Birthday Party. Our manager also wanted to release it as an album, but we said no. I thought it would damage video sales, and I also thought it was a con, another cash-in thing. We didn't think it was good enough as an album either. After all, we hadn't played for 5 months before those 2 shows. It became an issue between us and Doug Smith. That went on for years, fighting and f***ing. He finally won. It's hard to think now why we were so adamant, but at the time, it seemed real important. After the Hammersmith Odeon gigs, we toured Scandinavia for a month. We played just about everywhere there was to play, above the Arctic Circle, every town. They have fairs in the summer in Sweden, so we did all of them. All of Norway and a couple dates in Finland. Our last gig was in Gothenburg, Sweden. Our present drummer, Mikey D, was living there, and we never knew. We called it the It Never Gets Dark tour because it doesn't get dark there in the summer. The sun just gets low on the horizon, and then it comes up again. In Norway, we had the promoter from hell. He kept telling us the wrong distances from gig to gig, so we kept missing the ferries. Norway's all fjords, and you have to keep catching ferries, and we missed about half of them and had to take speedboats. It was really annoying, not to mention expensive, and we were constantly late for gigs. Once we got to the show really late, we walked into the dressing room to find a bowl of cold water, like 1 beer in it, 3 yogurts, a few biscuits, and fruit and nuts, bear food. So I said to the promoter, "Hey, come here a minute." And I hit him with the 3 yogurts before he got out the door. A bit later on, the door opened a crack, and a bottle of vodka was rolled across the floor to us. Finally, in Trondheim, we got totally fed up with him and covered him with squirty cheese. It was the 5th time we'd had to take a speedboat, and we were 2 hours late for the show, and we were really pissed off. Kids always think it's the band's fault when the gig starts late. So there we were on stage at last, and this of a promoter was leaning against the PA like he was some big deal because it was his hometown, and our roadies came up behind him and grabbed him, handcuffed him, dragged him out on stage, and pulled his trousers down. Then they squirted him with the squeezy cheese and mayonnaise and anything else they could get their hands on. Our tour manager at the time, Graham Mitchell, walked up to the mic and said to the audience, "See that hole? That's why we're late tonight." And per-doom, we pushed him off the stage. The guy wound up going to the police station, like that, covered in slop in a taxi. After the gig in the dressing room, we got the inevitable loud thump, thump, thump on the door, and it was this giant cop. The Norwegians are real tall. They look like the super Gestapo. "I think you have done something very awful to this person," he informed us. "Yeah? Well, he told us all the wrong directions and all." We told him the story. Yes, he said, "but this is no reason to cover a man with cheese." It was the cheese that seemed to bother him, not the assault. It was a cheese thing. Strange. When we got back to London, we did a few things around town before heading back to the States. Hawkwind was doing an anti-heroin gig at Crystal Palace, and I got up and did a couple numbers with them. At this juncture, I would like to mention that I think these anti-drug gigs are a joke. They're generally set up by people who are smashed out of their minds, which already defeats the object. And what do you do with the money you get from an anti-heroin gig anyway? They just set up cleanup centers or rehabs that don't really work. No drug taker worth his name is ever going to listen to the people who are in charge at those places, because they run them like youth clubs, which is the very reason you start taking the stuff in the first place, as a mark against your parents' generation. You don't want to be herded somewhere and told you're a bad boy. That isn't the way to do it. You lock them in the room until they're clean and then let them out and see if they stay clean. That's all you can do. And actually, it's not even much use doing that, because a smack addict has to want to be clean. They got to come to you. You don't do things like offer them rehab instead of jail either. Obviously, who's going to choose jail for sake? They go to rehab to get the heat off them and maybe get rid of the annoying girlfriend. Then they get clean, and it's cheaper for them for a couple months afterwards, because they only have to take a fraction of what they were doing before. From my vantage point, the old drug war is a mess. Anyway, enough of that. Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics were playing at Camden Palace, so me and Wurzel got up and did a couple of our own songs with them, Jailbait and No Class. They released a video of that show, if you can find it now. The next month, November, we were in the US, and I finished up the tour by appearing on MTV with Dee Snider. By then, we'd had very good news. Our litigation problems with Bronze were over, and we could begin 1986 by making a new record. Well, that's the end of Chapter 9. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 9 in the comments below. Before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon, Matt and Stacy from Canada. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.